we're up to the last session. An hour of this, then lightning talks, which I'll explain then, interesting announcement, and then the reception. So this last session you can think of as none of the above. I think that's the common thread of all of these people. And to understand the session and my interest in this group, some of you know John Brockman, who publishes an interesting book. And he does interesting things. And the last of a series of books was to ask, what is the last question? And my question for it was whether there's a Turing test for living rather than thinking. It can distinguish animate from automata. And to understand the question, my lab was part of a collaboration that created the minimal synthetic organism. We did the microfluidics part of you design life in a computer, synthesize the genome, load it into a cell, and boot a cell with a completely synthetic genome to create synthetic life. And another project in my lab is creating assemblers that assemble assemblers from the parts they're assembling, so self-reproducing machines we're developing. And so those are really creating, by a lot of different definitions, synthetic living things. And so for me, interspecies doesn't stop with the existing species, and Vince's question about new species. We're at a point now where you can really create life from scratch. And animate life from scratch, and blurring the boundary between what is animate and what is inanimate. And so for me, one of the really interesting questions is, in a world where you can create life, where does this boundary even live? And so this is ranging from close in to further out of brave people willing to look at questions like that. And we're going to start much closer in with interfaces, the technology for interfacing, and then look further and further away. One of the things I wanted to mention, my younger brother, some of you know, he ran the video game studio at Activision, which he built into the world's biggest video game studio, got tired of running, not he, but games running around shooting things, and he started Eline Media to do games for education and social change. And they're just releasing this really interesting project. They work with David Gruber, Samantha Joy, a number of interesting people on an immersive experience in the oceans to help you understand the oceans with the BBC, a bunch of other groups. And right at the heart of the game is interspecies communication in this immersive virtual environment where you learn to communicate in the ocean as part of survival of the ocean, which is really an interesting just data point in the technology for starting to think about interfaces. He couldn't come, but sent this slide to show that project is a coming attraction. And is David here? Yeah, so you can talk about that, right? Good. So we'll hear about that in the lightning talks. Good. So with that as background, we will start right in with Marcelo.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great honor to be here with so many legends in the field. And let me tell you about our work. I have, for the past 6 years, more or less, been working with Diana to try to elucidate dolphin communication, and in my case, mostly through technological means, namely trying to develop the technology to try to capture and as much of their behavior and their vocalizations as feasible, and try to actually, make up a system in which we can have some semblance of a chance at actually deciphering what we're saying. So I believe you've already seen this. This is an experiment that Diana did in the dawn of time with a touch with a keyboard. That was what could be achieved at the time. And what we tried to do was to extend this to the modern realm and try to get an actual computer touchpad that was capable of fully extensible, programmability. And here the fundamental problem is that dolphins are, and I don't think anybody has said this, dolphins are difficult to work with. They are extremely smart. They are bored in captivity. and they simply will play with absolutely anything you put in the pool until they break it. The moment at which they break it, it becomes a hazard to them, and at that point the animal welfare committee of the aquarium tells us that our permit for doing research with them is terminated. Therefore, we cannot be building stuff arbitrarily and put, and to be quite frank, a phenomenal amount of effort from my lab has gone into actually creating a technology that's safe to be put in a pool together with dolphins, okay? So when we tried to create a touchpad, we had a variety of options, trying to have something coated with film with different touch sensing, and we ended up having a system in which we made a touchpad that they literally can't touch. So it's a purely optical device. This optical device, here is Anna Hochevar, who was the postdoc that co-developed this device with us. This device has two parts, of course. It has a projector and a rear projection film, which we use to project images onto that the dolphins can see, the part that the dolphins react to. Now, in addition to that, we need to be able to sense when they touch something, okay, in a way that they are not actually touching anything. So the way we do this is by using an infrared lamp. Is there a laser pointer anywhere here?
You want a pointer?
Yeah, I mean...
The pointer is the mouse. Oh, no, let's see. No.
Okay. So what we do is we light up the screen using an infrared lamp. And the virtue of using infrared is that it only penetrates in the water for about 5 to 6 centimeters and is completely invisible to the dolphin's eyes otherwise. And so by working in infrared, not only do we have the benefit that only we light up the area immediately adjacent to the touchscreen, okay, we also eliminate any glare from the surface because our touchscreen has to operate during daylight hours, and often we have sunlight streaming by. Okay, in order to eliminate the back glare from the screen, we have two polarized filters. Okay, so we shine polarized infrared light onto the screen, and a cross polarizer eliminates the reflection from the skin proper. So the only thing that we see lighting up in our camera is whatever it lies on the pool side. Okay, so that lights up, and then a camera 30 times a second grabs an image, finds out whether there's something lit up, finds out if there's something that satisfies the criterion for being touched by a dolphin rostrum. We of course had to make up these fake plastic dolphin rostrums and send the divers there to touch the thing with it to calibrate this thing. And whenever the device sees that there is a suitable touch, it emits into the operating system a touch a mouse down event. I'm in the techie section, so I'm allowed to say this, right? You know, it's all nerds here. So eventually the computer believes that it has an extra mouse, and that the extra mouse is commanded by the dolphins, okay? And this is what we do with our extra mouse. We can, here you're seeing 4 panels. The top left and right are the right and left view of the camera. Then you have the view of the touchpad from across the pool. And on the bottom right, you have what we are actually projecting, which is a video game of whack-a-mole with fish. So whenever the dolphin touches a fish, the fish goes scampering away. And this was Foster's, this is one of our males, this was Foster's very first exposure to this device. And as you can see, within 30 seconds of being exposed to this technology, he's essentially playing a video game. Okay? He immediately got it. He is touching. He's not, you may appreciate that he's not actually trying to eat the fish. He's just touching them with his forehead. Mercifully, our touchpad detected that as being a legitimate touch. And in about 5 or more seconds, he's going to become bored with this, and then he's going to go around swimming, trying to see whether he can actually play this game while moving. So now he comes, you see him going around, and he comes at speed, and boom, there he goes, okay, and he turns around again, okay, and he's gonna see, can I touch it while I'm doing this? And boom, okay? So here you have this great example of how we made a technology and the dolphin immediately was able to engage with it. Okay? This is another example. Is it moving already? Or? This is another more recent example of other things that we've been using our device with. We can use it, of course, to project images. And here you have our two male dolphins who are now looking into the screen when we project images of their female friends, which are in the other pool. And you can see the excitement as they see their friends on the screen, okay, and how they are trying to actually peer into the side of the screen as though it was a window. And they haven't actually seen them in person for about a month at this stage, okay, because they had to be kept separate for a while. And and now that their friends are gone, okay, and there's a blue screen, they go away and they relax. So the thing is, we have a perfectly generic device that's capable of doing anything. We can put absolutely anything on the screen. We can put a web browser, we can put Skype, we can put Photoshop for them to play with, and there's a number of different applications that we've been developing to try to really fathom the depth of their cognition by using this device. So in the minute I have left, okay, I would like to make a case that actually came up during this study for sensory range translation. So one of the problems we have when trying to interface ourselves or trying to interface different species on this kind of device is that all of these animals have completely different sensory ranges. The physical magnitude of the quantities that they can hear, they can see, they can smell are physically distinct. And then the question becomes, how would we actually manage to translate the sensory range of one species to another? For instance, we have that elephants communicate in infrasound, dolphins communicating high frequencies through ultrasound. It would be completely futile to try to put them together, okay, linked by a telephone that was designed for human beings. Okay, it just wouldn't happen, nothing would go through. So the question is, what are the algorithms that we're going to use, and how are we going to study how these animals actually see the world, how do they experience their sensory environment, okay, so that we can communicate effectively with them. And here I want to tell you about, do we have a minute?
1 minute.
Okay, I want to tell you about one very simple example, okay, which is that we don't yet know the exact range of dolphin vision. We know that from genetics, they should not be able to see red or orange, okay? They should only see green and blue wavelengths of light, okay? This is extremely well established in their genetics, okay? However, when you examine them behaviorally, what you get is that, in fact, they don't see red, they don't see yellow, they see green and blue the way they are expected to see, but on the other hand, their sensitivity curve shoots up in the violet. And there's 2 orders of magnitude of violet sensitivity unaccounted for by the known chromophores that they have in the retina. So we have no idea how is it that they're actually seeing. So since there was this dispute, I decided to do what I consider to be the laziest experiment in the history of dolphin research, which is I went to the pool with a 405 nanometer laser pointer, violet laser pointer. And as you can see, our 2 males in this case, I have similar data for the females, okay, immediately saw the violet dot that was barely visible to us humans because we are 100 times less sensitive to violet than dolphins are, okay, and they immediately started following the dot. Okay, and with that, I would say we need to understand how we're going to project images to them, whether instead of having red, green, and blue projectors, we're going to have green, blue, and violet projectors, and how exactly are we going to solve this entire family of problems for all of the species. And with this, I would like to thank you and thank all my many collaborators. Thank you.
First, just a reminder that questions are streaming through here for the panel at Slido, sli.do. Number is 7414 to join. And that talk ends with a great lead-in to Gabe.
Thanks, Neil. Might as well start at the beginning. I first learned about the Center for Bits and Atoms when I was a postdoc at Harvard, and my housemate happened to be in Neil's group, and I thought, wow, bits and atoms in the same center, how crazy. Sam Kalish, who just graduated, I think he's here somewhere. Now I work at the San Diego Zoo, and it's been my pleasure to keep in touch with Neil a little bit. He had an opportunity to come and talk to our board about this idea, which you can speak about better than I. The board was bemused, I think. And I thought I would start my presentation with an answer to the most common question I get at the zoo, which is, what is my favorite animal? It's the miniature donkey. This one's named Sophia, and it's named after Sophia Loren, whose hair is equally beautiful, apparently. I think it's one of the hardest things to consider about animal perception and mind for humans. What is it like to be a bat? Like the famous question that Nagel asked. You kind of have to turn to poetry almost to start to feel that you are pointing in the right direction. And I really like this quote from Rainer Maria Rilke. If the confident animal coming toward us had a mind like ours, the change in him would startle us. But to him, his own being is endless, undefined, and without regard for his condition, clear like his eyes. Where we see future, he sees all, and himself and all, and made whole for always. This is a kind of a romantic embodiment of animal mind, but nevertheless, I think it's a nice kind of direction to consider in opposition to the one that animals have no perception of their world similar to ours, or a similar kind of completely agnostic ways of thinking about animals. In the context of Interspecies Internet, I'd like to kind of present this idea or question of, beyond the act of telecommunication, communicating between individuals at distance, is there room or space to think about telecommunity? So even beyond a dialogue, what about a trialogue? What about collective behavior? What about all of these forums that emerge on the human version of the internet where over great distances, communities form? I find that really fascinating. So of course, a step toward that is to consider two nodes or animals connecting, but I think it's also interesting to consider a whole community. In the context of community, this is one of the sites I work. I'm just going to present really quickly. The San Diego Zoo, for those of you who haven't been, is a 100-acre reserve in San Diego, not surprisingly. It looks like this. There's a Skyfari that connects two opposite corners. There's also a sister facility called the Safari Park, 1,800 acres or so, half of which is a wildlife reserve. It's much more open. The exhibit design is multi-species in general. There are all kinds of coexisting animals in large 40 to 60 acre enclosures. We have also the longest zip line, or it used to be the longest zip line in North America. You go over the rhinos. There's also a third branch in addition to the zoo and the safari park called the Institute for Conservation Research. That's officially where I live now as a senior scientist. It looks like a kind of human enclosure that you're maybe used to from universities. We also have these conservation projects around the world. So the zoo is a nonprofit annual operating budget is near 350 million, and we have over 6 million visitors a year. In the context of my work, I've been thinking about redesigning this kind of human-centered input device for other animals. And so one of the beginning questions, and I'm going to sort of work through examples, one of the beginning questions is, what elements do you need as a foundation to start considering interspecies internet? So along the lines of what was just mentioned, animals communicating in so many different fashions. What if there were an elephant-based telephone? So this is something we've been exploring. Elephants have been translocated as part of their general care. A larger herd that used to be based at our facility is split and now partially in Arizona, for example, and another part in Texas. So signals are produced. You have to, this is kind of a basic framework for encoding a signal, transmitting the signal, reproducing the signal, and then transducing that signal into another biological agent. So like starting with one herd of elephants and getting to another, you have to imagine encoding or detecting the information, designing an interface to do that, compressing it, transmitting it, and then recreating it. And this is a kind of a general framework for considering how information could move between two places. Vint said something similar earlier about things that connect agents across space require signal transduction and all of these other elements that are part of how information is shared online, but we don't often think of it in other species terms. So I wanted another example of a project that we've done exploring this kind of thing, in this case an interface for birds, with Rebecca Kleinberger, Janet Baker, who are in the audience, and thanks to Irene for some helpful conversations also. This is a bird joystick that we call the Joi branch. So it's an 8-way triggered joystick that is attractive for birds to interact with and framed in a way that blends into their environment. So this is something that a human would never design or use, but it's exploring the first part of this kind of foundational transmission, signal transmission arc. How do you create an interface that is attractive and interesting to another species? So here's some simple clips. It's showing how this blue macaw that lives in the safari park is triggering music. So here he's just beginning his explorations of the branch as something that is interesting to play with and tug. He triggers the music and then sometimes does some dancing like the earlier bird we saw, Snowball. And then he exhibits a new behavior, which is really interesting to us, where he's hooking on to the branch, like kind of leaning on the on switch, so to speak, which is something they would never do toward a natural branch on a tree. But here he's just seeming to really fixate on the idea that his actions can trigger this sound. Here's another instance where he's just kind of enjoying the sound. This is one of his favorite songs. We should get some more Peter Gabriel songs for him. I'm sure he would like those too. So, okay. We also experimented with other methods of triggering the music, like motion. So here he's dancing, and when he performs a dance move in the absence of music, we initiate the music. So other kind of interface concepts. So I really quickly wanted to talk about the other side of a transmission arc, in this case, designing a terminal, a signal reproduction element for humans that you could imagine connecting to another species. So this is part of a design for what we call the bat sense. It's a wearable designed for 8 to 12-year-olds that goes with this transmitter that is designed to either be a prey item or a pollination target for bats. So we did some circuit design and created, this is what we call the target. And the mask uses an ultrasound detector that reads objects in around the sensor as a function of the reflectivity at certain distances. So we sonify data like that, and you get sounds like this that actually sound a bit like whales. This is just a sound representation of objects at different distances. We're experimenting with how one could be in a different sensory world. So this is the kind of concept you would have kids and exploring the sensory world of another animal, a sense shifter kind of. This is a prototype. I don't think, Neil, you've seen this. This is part of a larger concept of this is about 4 or 5 years old, conceptual sketches of what we call tech to reconnect, tools to explore and discover nature, or think about other sensory worlds. See heat like a snake, hear through your foot like an elephant. Time's up.
Take some of the question time. You fielded some of those at the zoo that let you see like a giraffe. Talk about some of the experience of exposing people to animal senses.
Okay. One of my favorite stories was a little girl who, one of the devices I quickly moved through was essentially a glorified periscope, but it was a binocular periscope where one can see 15 feet higher vantage point in near real time through Oculus Rift goggles, and you could carry this device around with you, and it felt like you were very, very tall. And so a little girl looked through this device at real giraffe, which is kind of part of the concept, was considering the other sensory world, the perspective of another species. And she told her mom as she was walking away, like, wow, I really like giraffes. And the mom's like, you didn't like giraffe before? And she's like, well, now I see that they see the world differently than us. And it was like a very beautiful moment of, it wasn't on camera, it wasn't being recorded. She was just having the spontaneous response of understanding that other species see things differently. This is a very last thing. This is a device for elephant to interact with sound. Early prototype. Essentially, it's a multi-sided device that plays different sounds as a function of the sight that's facing up. So it's manipulable by an elephant, and elephants apparently really enjoy sounds and music, but have no choice and control about what sounds and music they're exposed to. So literally just yesterday, this was tested at the zoo. So I have this fresh video. This will be the last element. So we embedded this device inside this cube, and this is an older elephant named Mary exploring. I think she's smiling here, but it's hard to tell on that. So we are aiming to put different types of surfaces on all the edges and make it easier to turn and so on. And this is a concept of interaction with orangutans that has not been implemented yet, co-creating symmetric art on a semi-transparent interactive screen. So that's it. Evolution.
We can mix in questions as we go. There's a question, what if the elephants were having a terrible time and this was what being transmitted? Is all communication good?
Anybody who has a significant other would have a response to that question too. I don't think all communication is good, but it doesn't mean that it isn't good to try. Just leave it at that.
Okay, and I'm impressed your designs have progressed since I last saw your engineering.
I've had help too.
You guys hear me okay? Hello? Cool. Thanks for hosting me. This is super fun to be here. Cool. So if I'll ask something weird, we've been at this now for about 2.5 years, and we haven't showed anyone what we're working on. I know it's a weird request, but if you could try, or if you didn't post this on social media, I'd really appreciate it. I'm not sure where the video is going. I probably should have asked Diana before this, but I'll roll with it. I'm going to try to convince you of 3 things. The first is that this generation of technology that we're currently launching, like literally right now, is going to massively deepen and widen our understanding of and ability to communicate with animals. 2, these revolutions start with consumer applications that can scale. They scale because consumers love and care about them. And 3, I and we at Companion Labs will always try to be fun to talk to, at least try to be thoughtful partners if we can be. So we'd love to chat. I'm going to cheat a little bit and use a video to introduce ourselves. Good communication, good training makes us feel really close to our animal. That's what we ultimately want. But training is really hard. It requires patience, knowledge, and a lot of time that most folks don't have. Companion Labs can train your dog at a professional level in the convenience of your own home for a fraction of the cost of professional training.
Sit. Being able to clearly articulate what we mean when we say certain key terms gives a dog sort of a sense of security.
To really train a dog, you have to understand body language. You have to have good timing. And third, you have to be consistent and reward the behavior every single time.
These are things that humans try our hardest, but it's really tough for us. And these are things that are really easy for computers.
The device can fit almost anywhere, and it interacts throughout the day with the dog in the home.
Here's how it works. You plug it in, you put the treats in it, you record your voice, and we're good to go. We first teach the dog that really great things happen around the device, using light, sound, and treats. As soon as the dog understands that fun things happen around the device when it's on, we look for the behaviors that you want to train.
Our sensors are essentially watching the dog. Let's say we want to train the dog to sit. As the dog does that behavior, the sensors record it, the machine learning interprets the posture. At that point, we reinforce it with some food, and you'd be amazed how quickly dogs catch on to the fact that the behavior that they were doing is what triggers the food release.
And then as soon as your dog understands that every time it sits, that can get a treat, we then introduce your own voice.
Sit. Yes.
Under the hood, we have the base algorithms that are actually identifying what the dog is doing. Once we understand what the dog is doing, we understand what that means and how to take action with it. And all of these software systems control the high-speed hardware around it.
Every animal at some point in their life is going to be left alone for a few hours. So it's really nice to have something there that can train them to do a behavior that I would like to see. And then when I can come home, I can reinforce and build on top of that.
We work with hundreds of dogs, and we've generated massive amounts of data and shown the technology works across all breeds, all ages of animals. 60 million households that have a dog in the U.S. spend billions of dollars on their dogs every year. And this is a massive market.
Beyond that, this platform offers a whole range of things we can do.
Think of the possibilities of training the animal to walk back and forth in front of the camera so we can look for aberrations in its health.
We can notice gait changes that might be indicative of orthopedic problems. It's incredibly powerful.
The team we're building at Companion Labs, we can go solve any of these problems. These are experts in computer vision, high-speed software, hardware, animal behavior. This is the exact team you want to have to create a great product, solve a huge problem, and build a massive business. And how many other companies do you have that can bring joy into the world in a business that can scale? Cool. Okay, that was me cheating. Let's see. I'm John. I've got a background in engineering. I was lucky enough to join 2 startups that ended up scaling, one in clean technology, one in cloud. The Google alum. I never got to meet Vint at Google, but I worked in Google X, also working with Bits and Atoms and the TensorFlow team. My colleague, Paul Mundell, used to run Canine Companions for Independence. It's up in just north of San Francisco. It's a group of about 300 people that trains dogs to help people in wheelchairs and help people with PTSD. He's worked for, and he's also the chairman of the International Working Dogs Association. If you come visit us at our office in San Francisco, we'd love to have you. We're based on the roof of one of the largest centers of animal welfare on the West Coast, the SFSPCA, which is at City Block. That's our isolation ward from 1935 on the roof that we gutted, put a couple of line-of-sight data transmitters on, and we've been working there for the last couple of years. We're super excited to be co-located with an animal shelter because we're using the Thomas model. The things that we're doing with rich people's consumer dogs at home are the same things that get dogs adopted from shelters and help them stay adopted. If you can train an animal, it's 50% more likely to get adopted. It's 2.5 times more likely to stay adopted. It's massively powerful. We've been there free of rent for a long time, and this relationship means the world to us. We're soon to be 3 offices in the Bay Area, 1 in Marin, 1 in San Francisco, 1 in Santa Cruz. We have a team composed of computer vision folks, behavioral folks, hardware, and human interaction folks. So the thing that excites me most is the natural implication from 2 facts. Fact 1, which you guys know way better than I do, is all animals primarily communicate through, can you hear me? Okay. Animals primarily communicate through movement and posture. This is both conscious communication, so how I gesture when I talk to you guys, in addition to unconscious communication, how I hold myself, how that changes over time. Do I walk slowly? Do I slump? You can tell quite a bit about a person and animal by that. We miss a lot today. The dog sitting by the door is telling you it needs to go outside. Like, what are the other signals that we're missing from that dog? Like, lots and lots of folks are missing these things. This applies to all animals. Fact 2 is that we literally now have the technology at the network's edge. So what I mean by edge is your phone, your car, the edge of the telecommunication, the edge of the internet, basically, that can sense motion and posture in real time. If you guys have an iPhone 10 in your pocket, this is available to you right now on the top of your phone. This is a depth camera working with, I think, a GPU on that thing. Understanding that it's your face. And so it's understanding, or you could understand an animal's posture using the same type of technology. And this is all due to cars and phones. Like, this is driving a massive explosion of this type of technology at the edge. And you're also, with this scale comes massive open software, so the ability to create things on top of it. So hit it directly, like this is specifically low-cost depth cameras and low-cost GPUs. So if you put these 2 facts together, like fact 1, all animals primarily communicate through movement and posture. In fact 2, we have this rise of sensing and compute. Like, you can't help but realize we're gonna have a far deeper and wider understanding of all animals in the next 5, 10, 20 years. This is inescapable, which is what got me so excited, and I left Google a couple years to start this company. Thinking through, with any of these revolutions, I think, and actually, this work you guys have presented so far is super cool. I love the interfaces you guys described. If anything, our interface is just the animal's body. But with all these things, I think you need to attach this interface to a consumer product that can scale because people care about it. Generally, when we looked at other examples around similar products or products that might be driving into a new area, we noticed like a couple of trends. 1, the products that did the best were those that were better than existing. So our animal training is like, we built a generalized interface to interact with the dog, but we're doing one thing really well, which is training first. And we're doing that better than anyone's ever seen it before. So instead of 100 messy human repetitions, we're doing 10,000 from a superhumanly precise machine. It displays your passion, so we have a beautiful device for your living room that links your purchase to helping an animal in a shelter. And 3, it's delightful. There's tons of fun things that we're gonna announce and do with this device. 60 million US homes have a dog. We're about to start a conversation with lots of them. Like, we're super, super excited about the data we're gonna generate, and we'd love to talk to you guys about it. Handful of implications. I think many of folks in the room have already touched on this, but what drives me, what I'm most excited about is that understanding drives empathy. Like, you can't help but create more empathy if you create a platform like this. Done right, it could translate across animals. Am I sick? Am I stressed? Will you eat me? And to borrow a visual from Coco, what happens if we reduce teaching or language teaching? Cost to 0. That's essentially what we've done with the platform. Instead of hours and hours and hours of human repetition, human labor to train these types of things, we can bring the cost down to 0. This means that thank you. This means that the dog that used to cost $100,000 to help the person in the wheelchair that my colleague trained now can cost the cost of food or the cost of slightly more advanced. And you can not only do this with posture or helping kind of positional commands to help with folks in wheelchairs. There's a wide variety of other things you can do. Anyway.
You. And let's see, there's 2 good questions for you. One is, do dogs benefit from being trained by a human from a social perspective? Is computerized automated training less satisfying even if it's more effective?
Cool.
The second is, can people train inappropriate behaviors using your machine? Yeah.
how would you expect a cow to ask if they're going to be eaten?
So for the recording, the third question is, how can a cow ask to not be eaten?
Cool. So the first question, does the dog benefit from being trained from a social perspective? Absolutely. Just like full stop. You need to socialize animals. Like every single animal needs to be socialized. We will never, ever be between an owner and their companion animal. Like we're the helping hand that can be there where you can. So we will never feed a dog all of its food through our device because we always want to have, for the human to have that meal with the animal at home. And if anything, our platform actually encourages the folks to take them out on walks afterwards to have that social time, to have that bonding time. The next question was, can people
training killer dogs?
Weaponized dogs? No. So we control the platform. There's a variety of ways we'd like to open up that platform, but we'll never do so in a way that that we believe could lead anything bad to happen to an animal, any human or dog. And the last one, how could you sense if a cow wants to be eaten or not? I don't think we can sense that, but I think we can sense if the cow's panicked or anxious. I think we could scream that to people really loudly.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
And Marcelo and Gabe, there were two overlapping questions. For Marcelo, there's a question for you. Do you need to redo all of your work from scratch for each species, or is there transference between species? And Gabe, the question for you is, have you tried crossing signals? So like the elephone talks to the bats.
Between species.
Yeah.
Let's see, Marcelo and then Gabe.
Well, it would be a great idea to be able to have some inter-range in which or some abstract representation in which we can translate for all the animals, right? But I think that we're going to have to do a lot of research to see whether that is, that kind of Esperanto, sensory Esperanto is actually visible or...
Which, of course, we heard about from Asa and Britt in part with good data here. Telephones to bats?
Not yet. I'll say.
Would it work? Have you tried?
I think there's a really good point earlier that there has to be some frequency translation and accurate reproduction of all of the symbols. I think it's also a matter of what would they say.
Yeah, I mean,
why is it interesting?
I'm sure the question assumes all of that you're changing time and frequency and modulation.
Yeah. I think that there's a nested question that is also really interesting, which is what content is worth helping animals facilitate. I think even a lot of times when animals are together in person or in real life, it's not clear what information they're sharing that is important to them or not, and how we as humans can appreciate what that information might be is not always obvious. It's a difficult thing to consider.
Okay. And now for something completely different, Kate.
Yeah, so I don't work with animals, and I don't build technology. I work in human-robot interaction. But Neil knew that I was writing a book that looks at the history of animal domestication and what lessons we could learn from that when we're trying to integrate robotic technology. And he said, hey, I'm organizing this Interspecies Internet thing. Do you want to come? And I said, hell yes. And Neil said, okay, but why do you want to come? And I said, well, you know, my book is kind of tangentially related to this because of animal skill sets and intelligence. But honestly, the real reason I want to come is because it seems to me that this project brings together people who care not only about a new research question or building something cool, but also who seem to really care about animals. And that warms my cold black heart. And Neil said, okay, you're in. So here I am. And I'd like to share two kind of bird's eye view perspective observations from my work that I think could be relevant here. And the first is about valuing diverse skill sets. Because 19 months ago, I had a baby, and ever since then, people have been saying to me, Kate, you must find it so interesting to watch your child's brain develop and compare it to artificial intelligence. And I don't think that's very interesting at all. I think my child's brain is a million times more interesting than any technology we've ever developed. And also, that's not why I'm interested in robots. The reason I'm interested in technology is because it's shaping the world that my child is growing up in. But there's this thing that we do sort of constantly when we talk about artificial intelligence and robots, which is we compare robots to people and artificial intelligence to human intelligence. Whether we're talking about robots taking all the jobs, whether we're creating stock photo images of what a robot looks like, whether we're comparing my child's brain to an AI, we do this all the time. And I just don't think it's the right analogy because artificial intelligence is not like human intelligence. I mean, your calculator is smarter than you already. And on the other hand, if you've tried to have a conversation with your phone recently, it goes like, oh, Siri, I'm bleeding very badly. Could you please call me an ambulance? And Siri will say, okay, I will no longer call you Kate. I will now call you an ambulance. So I'm not sure if Siri actually does that. Don't try it at home, but you get my point. AI has a very different set of strengths and weaknesses than humans do. And so I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that. And I think animals are actually a much better analogy in this context, not because animals learn like artificial intelligence, but because we have partnered with animals throughout history for work and weaponry and companionship. And we've partnered with them because their skill sets are so different from ours. So we've trained dolphins to, find lost underwater equipment because they have this echolocation system that is so much better than anything that we could build at the time. And so it's powerful to acknowledge and explore the existence of different types of intelligence and skill sets, and it's important to value that and foster that diversity. And I think that this project is pretty well set up to do that when it comes to animal communication. So I think that's really awesome. Now, the other observation I wanted to make has to do with the double-edged sword of anthropomorphism and what human-robot interaction teaches us about our relationship with animals. So I know that anthropomorphism is kind of a controversial topic in animal research because, on the one hand, projecting our own experiences onto animals can lead to some really important or interesting research questions. But of course, we often get our interpretations wrong when we're projecting ourselves, and so that can mess with unbiased or objective research results. But my interest in anthropomorphism is that people do it, and that we do this all the time and with things that aren't even animals. So people will treat robots like they're alive, even though they know perfectly well that they're just machines. And part of this is the influence of science fiction and pop culture, but part of this is because robots trigger some of the biological instincts that we have. So, for example, it seems that our brains are evolutionarily hardwired to project intent and agency onto movement in our physical space for good reason. And robots tap into that. And people will do this even with very, very simple robots, like the Roomba vacuum cleaner. It's just a disc that roams around the floor to clean it, but it's moving around on its own. And so people will name their Roomba. I think more than 85% of Roombas have names. I don't know the numbers for toasters. I guarantee you it's less than that. And people will feel bad for the Roomba when it gets tangled in the curtains. People will actually send in their Roombas for repair to the company that makes them, iRobot. And the company will say, oh, here's a brand new replacement Roomba for you. And they'll say, no, we want you to fix Meryl Sweep and send her back to us. So that's just a moving disc, right? The field of social robotics deals with robots that are specifically designed to trigger this response in people. And the field of human-robot interaction, almost more so than its precursor, human-computer interaction, is showing that people really respond to these cues that they get from these lifelike machines. And so research by myself and many others is showing that people empathize with robots, even if they know that the cues they're getting are completely fake. Now, there are some pundits in the technology ethics space who say that this is a bad thing, that it's sad that people are pouring all of their emotion into these empty hulls instead of into each other, and that that's going to destroy our humanity. And I've always thought that was kind of a weird take on it, because when people get a dog and pour their emotion into the dog, we're not like, oh, you're not going to have any more human friends. But also, I don't think that empathy is a zero-sum game. Some of our research indicates that people who empathize with robots are more likely to empathize with humans and animals. And also, there are some really cool use cases for treating robots like they're alive. They are starting to be able to engage autistic children in ways that we haven't seen previously. They're starting to be able to use robots as animal therapy replacements where we can't use real animals, because the robots can have a similar therapeutic effect to the animals. So I don't think that it's inherently a bad thing that we anthropomorphize the robots. Now, that said, I do think it's interesting that human-robot interaction research is revealing something about ourselves that people may not want to face necessarily. So we know that robots aren't alive and they don't feel anything. And I know some people want to have the conversation of what happens when we do create technology that can feel things. And I personally think that conversation is still best had while passing around a big fat joint. I think it's not very practical, but that's also why Neil is more successful than me. But I don't think it's relevant in my field, because what we're seeing is that people already treat the machines like they have an inner life and experience the world. And so I wonder, what does that say about our relationship with animals? Could that mean that our relationship with animals is much more one-sided than we would actually like to believe? Do we care more about what we project onto non-humans than what they're actually feeling? And unfortunately, if you look at the history of animal rights, you see a lot of evidence for this. People seem to care more about the animals that they relate to than any morally consistent biological criteria. We care more about whales that sing beautiful songs than whales that don't sing anything. So it's a tough pill to swallow. But I think that the fact that human-robot interaction might be just about to kind of shove this in people's faces and make it glaringly obvious could be an opportunity. It could be that this is now a moment where we can stop and we can reflect on our relationship with animals and reflect on our values and maybe try to adjust our behavior to be a little bit more in line with what we would like to see ourselves as doing. And I'm not normally this idealistic and optimistic, but it's very inspiring to see so many people in this room who seem to genuinely care about doing right by other species and seem to care about valuing and fostering diverse types of intelligence and communication, and building something that's not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of other creatures as well. And that's exactly the type of thoughtful empathy that I was hoping to find here today. So thank you.
Now, someone is asking, if my kids bark commands at Alexa, will they grow up to be a bad person?
Know if they'll grow up to be a bad person, but there were so many complaints from parents to Amazon who were saying, Alexa is teaching my kids to be assholes because she doesn't require please and thank you, that they actually released an update a few months ago, or I forget when it was, but they recently released an update that you can turn on where she will require you to say please and thank you.
Oh, interesting. But let's see. Are you saying, the negative version is that we're anthropomorphizing these animals and we're just reading ourselves into them and we're not dealing with them on their terms. The sign bit inversion of that is, in fact, they're turning us into them, that they're transforming us. Is this a positive or a negative message?
Well, that's why I said double-edged sword. I think, it's complicated.
So the answer is yes.
Sure, Neil.
The next talk needs a special introduction. I work with a number of both neurobio people and AI gurus. And in planning this last session, I had asked for two things. I asked for somebody who's doing biological tests of consciousness and self-awareness. And I figured with all the work on magnoencephalography and functional MRI, people must be studying how you sort of tell if somebody's home. And then for all the work on AI, I had asked for how you tell when Hal wakes up, how you test for awareness in AI. And both of those questions had a complete third rail, electric, don't go there, don't touch that reaction. I couldn't get anybody willing to talk about it. So I asked Phil. So Phil was an editor of Nature and has written a number of influential and really interesting books and happened to be writing about exactly these questions. And so he agreed to go out on a limb and talk about them.
Thank you, Neil. I also now know why I've been recommended to speak to you, Kate, because several of the things you said resonated completely. One thing I am working on at the moment, a book, is about the notion of a space of possible minds. What kinds of minds can exist? And how can we even think about that problem? Where in that space do humans come? Where do AI systems come, and where might they go? Where do animals come? Even where do extraterrestrial intelligences come, and how can we move our thoughts about that beyond this real anthropomorphism that I think exists at the moment? So that's what I was interested in thinking about. And the question also then arises, where does consciousness come in that space? Does it have to fill that whole space of possible minds, or is it just a subset of it? And Neil is absolutely right that actually talking about consciousness used to be, and apparently still is for some people, somewhere where you just didn't go. And now we can go there, and partly because it was posed in this way quite famously by David Chalmers as the hard problem. And really the hard problem that he's talking about is, why do we experience anything at all? And it's not clear that consciousness is adaptive. We might naively think it is, but when you think about it, an automaton could do just as well. So why have we got consciousness? Now, one of the benefits, perhaps, of having a complete non-expert like me talk about it is that you won't just get my pet theory. And I suspect that otherwise you might well get that. And what's striking to me as an outsider in this field is just how many theories there are and what range they cover. Everything is included, from the idea that consciousness is an illusion to the proposal that consciousness is in fact a widespread phenomenon throughout the universe, that it's not just limited to human minds or even to animal minds, but it might be there in a small degree to all sorts of systems in the universe. So maybe consciousness makes us unique as organisms, or conversely, maybe consciousness pervades the cosmos. You can take your pick. Now, I'm not completely without my opinions in this area, so I'll put them on the table straight away. First of all, this notion that consciousness is an illusion has always puzzled me. It seems a bit like saying your pain is an illusion. I don't quite know where we go with that. And in fact, the truth is that consciousness is all we have. This really was the position of the phenomenologists, the psychologists, who really took their lead from William James here at Harvard, who was once said to have ignored the traditional antithesis between reality and appearance. And that's not quite the same as saying we have to take everything just at face value. Science has taught us well enough not to do that. But it starts from recommending that we start with experience and work from there to try to get some picture of reality, rather than seeing if we can reconstruct experience from some abstract, objective point of view of reality. Another thing I'll insist upon is simply consciousness is not quantum mechanical. We don't need to go there, okay? We can leave that behind. And my third assertion is simply that this stuff matters. And perhaps it matters urgently for all sorts of reasons. One of them, of course, is the theme of this meeting, that questions about animal consciousness impinge on the moral status that we afford them. You can argue about whether or not that should be so, but it clearly is the case at the moment that it has some bearing on that question. We can also glimpse a time on the horizon, at least, where we have to start considering whether artificial intelligence systems might have some degree of consciousness. consciousness. What's more, doctors and physicians are confronted daily with the need to make assessments about the status of patients who are in comatose or vegetative states. And we also have some sense that this too impinges on the moral regard that we attribute to people, whether they still have any degree of consciousness. And there was, this was a recent headline, in fact, just last week in the New York Times, it was referring to this study that seemed to, was misreported, I should say, as suggesting that there may be many people who are in vegetative states who might in fact be conscious. Now, the report wasn't really suggesting this at all, but nevertheless, it underlines the urgent need to have some way of measuring this. And we don't even know how to define it yet, let alone how to measure it. And then there's this. This is what some call a mini brain, a brain organoid grown from stem cells in a dish, which shows some rudimentary sort of structures reminiscent of a fetal brain. And people are making these things for all sorts of reasons now. And these neurons are active, they're communicating with one another, and we don't know how to think about this activity. And let me tell you that this definitely gives me pause for thought, because this is not just any mini brain, this is my mini brain. This one was grown from some skin cells taken from my arm and reprogrammed into stem cells and then grown into this structure. So that is something to think about. And it's for reasons like this that recently more than 50 neuroscientists and cognitive scientists and psychologists called for a greater recognition of the importance of having more research on this difficult subject of consciousness. Now, there's some wide agreement, I guess, that consciousness involves the brain, but even that isn't uncontentious. There are certainly arguments for why cognition generally is a much wider affair than that it involves our bodies, it involves our environment. For example, I mean, it's trivially obvious that our thinking is affected by the stew of hormones that the rest of the body provides, including our mood. And it's because the brain is a soft and squishy organism of the body that depends on chemicals moving about inside it by diffusion, that I'm a bit cautious about models about the brain and cognition and consciousness that rely too heavily on computer analogies. There's probably something to be learned from the fact that in the 18th century, the dominant model of the nervous system was a hydraulic one. And then in the early 19th century, people thought of the brain as a battery. So there's a long tradition of thinking about the brain in terms of our most advanced technology, and it doesn't always, in retrospect, seem to be the best way of doing it. Now, I say there are many theories of consciousness, and there are plenty of books that you can read today that will tell you about different ideas, and I would recommend all of these books and others. These are all very smart people who have something worth listening to about consciousness. But how can we hope to make sense of all of these ideas? And I'm not going to try and do that. I don't have time to do that, but I want to give you a flavour of the thinking in this area by just talking briefly about a couple of theories. And I won't claim that these are leading candidates. There aren't really any leading candidates in this area, but they, I think, illustrate quite nicely some of the differences in points of view on this matter. And the first one was championed by, amongst others, by Stan Dehaene in Paris, and it's called global workspace theory. And it's a kind of computational model. So there are inputs and there are output signals, and there is some sort of processing going on in between in the brain. And it asserts that conscious behavior arises when sensory information is collected in what they call a cognitive workspace that is broadcast to other brain centers. You see, a distinguishing feature of our minds is that we can hold on to a piece of information as a sort of motivation for action. So if we're hungry, then by reflex, we salivate, but we also go into the kitchen and fix something to eat. And in global workspace theory, this conscious behavior arises when we hold on to a piece of information in this global workspace within the brain and then broadcast it to specific brain modules with specific tasks. And according to Dehaene, brain imaging studies suggest that there is a seat of this consciousness somewhere in the brain, and in fact that it's in the some part of the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And this idea that consciousness resides somewhere in the brain that we can locate, it relates to a leading sort of notion in consciousness research, which is that there are neural correlates of consciousness. There are patterns of neural activity that reflect the conscious state of the brain. And it does seem that we can rule out some parts of the brain. For example, the cerebellum at the sort of back of the brain here, which is a very dense structure. It's denser than the cortex. In fact, half of the neurons are in the cerebellum. But the cerebellum seems to play no role in consciousness at all. And so the question then arises, why is it that one set of neurons can produce consciousness, whereas another doesn't? And we really have no idea why that is so. And in contrast to global workspace theory, Christoph Koch of the Allen Institute for Brain Sciences in Seattle thinks he takes the view that this computational model of consciousness is just the dominant myth of our age. And he's been collaborating with Giulio Tononi in Wisconsin on a different model called integrated. Sorry, that's global workspace theory. I should have let you process that before I moved on to Christoph's book. He says that consciousness is not something that is turning inputs into outputs, but it's an intrinsic property of a cognitive network itself, a network that has specific features of its architecture. And this is a theory known as integrated information theory. That's what Giulio Tononi has called it. So in contrast to global workspace theory, which asks what the brain does to create conscious experience, integrated information theory begins with the experience itself. It says that there are aspects of a conscious experience that are irreducible. And there are aspects like it is subjective. It exists only for the conscious entity. It's structured, so the contents relate to one another. We can say the blue book is on the table. It's specific. The book is blue and not red. It's unified. There's only one experience. That's quite a strange thing about consciousness. There's only one experience at a time. And it's definitive. There are bounds to it. We're not conscious of everything all at once. And so from those axioms, Tononi and Koch have claimed to have deduced the properties that a physical system must have if it is to possess some degree of consciousness. And they say that it's something to do with the network architecture, that only certain architectures, specifically ones that have a feedback, so it's not just what's called a feed-forward processing, where one thing leads on to another. It has to have some kind of feedback process that allows the network to have an affective influence on itself. It can affect its own state. The properties of the past can affect its state in the future. And they say that if a network doesn't have these properties, if it's just one of these feed-forward networks, then it might seem to be doing something conscious, but it's actually acting just like a zombie network. And so within this idea, for one thing, they say that, again, you can locate an area of the brain that seems to have these properties, and it's not, they say, in the prefrontal cortex, but towards the back of the cortex. But Christoph Koch also believes that this makes consciousness a very general property that, in some ways, is an elementary property of living matter, he says, or of all matter, in fact. Now, this doesn't mean that consciousness is just spread everywhere, but it does mean that it is something that can be possessed by networks beyond human brains and beyond animal brains, but not, he feels, inside the circuits that we're currently building out of silicon. He believes that AI, at the moment, the way it's being done at the moment, cannot be conscious, even if it's extremely complicated. Now, I've picked these two theories to talk about, partly because they illustrate the range that exists in this thinking, but also because, as it happens, they are two theories that are being put to the test from around now, from this summer, in a series of experiments that has been funded by the Templeton Foundation to try to really zero in on some of the ideas around consciousness and to see whether we can devise and carry out discriminating tests, experimental tests, to see if we can narrow the number of theories. because these are by no means the only ones. And in fact, two of the most prominent other classes of theories about consciousness are called first-order and higher-order theories. And very briefly, the first-order theory says that there's just nothing more than basic cognitive processing of sensory information. That's what gives rise to consciousness. Higher-order theories say that the mind has to do something with a representation like that, over and above cognition itself, in order to produce consciousness. So that conscious experience is not merely a record of perceptions involved, but involves some additional mechanism that draws on that representation. Now, if all that sounds a little vague, that's a reflection, I think, of the really primitive state of theories of consciousness. And I sense a degree of frustration or even desperation around the issue of merely framing the question. I think perhaps the most reductive way we can frame this question is that a lot of philosophers of mind talk about consciousness as being something that we can meaningfully ask, what is it like to be that thing? And it comes down to Nagel's question of what is it like to be a bat? That's a question that we may not be able to answer, but we can frame it in the way that we can't so obviously meaningfully ask, what is it like to be an electron? However, Nagel himself thinks that it's going to require more than the tools we have at the moment to answer this question. He's recently said that in order to understand consciousness, we need a major conceptual revolution, at least as radical as relativity theory. And he suspects that this is a revolution that might involve non-materialist concepts. But some respond, and in fact, the biologist Matthew Cobb, in a forthcoming, he's about to bring out a book on the brain, which I would recommend, and he says this about that sort of outlook. He says, without some kind of pointers as to where we should look for this new theory, and above all, clear experimental evidence of its necessity, this is not of much help. And I think this is where we stand at the moment. And my sense is that unlike what we're often told, and in fact, just this afternoon, I read another paper that was suggesting that really what we need to understand consciousness is better tools, better neuroscientific tools, better ways to look at neurons and look at sort of networks of neurons. I suspect that it is going to need more than that, and that in fact, rather than just new techniques, the real problem is that we haven't yet found the proper articulation of the problem. I think it's one of these problems that once we start asking it in the right way, then we might find out that actually it wasn't quite the problem we thought it was all along. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Before you go, a couple things. One question is about the cerebellar sense of self. Any comment?
The cerebellar sense of self. I haven't read that book, but I can... So this is presumably saying what the cerebellum does for the sense of self. I think one quite compelling way to answer that question is that quite recently, a couple of years ago, a Chinese woman went in to have some neurological tests because she was someone who had slight learning difficulties, had some difficulties in coordination, and so they ran a brain scan on her. And they found that she had no cerebellum at all. She had been born without one. It was simply missing in the back of her brain, and yet she behaved completely as the rest of us do, as a conscious being. So I think there does seem to be, and you can also look at people who have had lesions of the cerebellum, and it doesn't seem to have any influence on their sense of self and their sense of consciousness. So. Sorry?
You can have a frontal lobotomy and still maintain consciousness. That's your favorite region.
The front of the cortex. I don't know how much. I don't know how much of it can go before that is a problem. But as I understand it, certainly the cortex does seem to be involved in some way.
The cortex. What's your
Now, so one of the things I learned from Diana was that all of the animal behavioral evidence is sense of self and identity is a continuum. That part of the species centrism is it wasn't a big bang, but there's a whole continuum of states. And most of what you presented seemed to be a binary state of you're conscious or you're not. rather than consciousness being a continuum?
I guess it depends on whether you're talking about the state of the brain or about the capacity of the mind. And what I mean by that is that we know that we can be in non-conscious states. I mean, I have been, we all have been. And I don't mean dreaming, I mean, under general anesthesia, for example. And some of the techniques that are being developed to try to spot whether a brain is conscious or not, use those two states to test. And that's a different issue from saying, does consciousness exist for a bat? Or is there a continuum? I mean, certainly Christoph and Giulio think in integrated information theory, think there is an absolute continuum that still persists a little bit down to the level of bacteria.
So your talk could be unfairly summarized as nobody knows anything.
It could
so that's why I want to pin you down. Take Jeremy's cow. If your life was on the line, like the cow's, to test for self-awareness, how would you do it? Mm-hmm. What's best current practice?
The study that I showed, let me go back to it actually, because it's kind of interesting how I'm not saying this reflects current practice, but it certainly reflects the way these things are talked about in the popular press. So, these brain imaging studies, and look how nicely they're labeled here. Vegetative state, minimally conscious, whatever that means, and fully conscious, and they're these brain scans. People who work on fMRI openly acknowledge you can tell next to nothing, really, from those scans about consciousness. Because it's such a blunt tool. You can tell some things about it. You can, it's meaningful to see some bit of the brain light up, but we don't know what's going on in there. We don't know if it's the same thing that's going on in there each time. And we certainly don't know enough about the neural correlates of consciousness to be able to label them in this way. But that's what we do. Now, there are other ways of looking, and in fact, Christoph Koch and others have developed a method that they say is now being used to try to test for consciousness, which involves basically, they call it zip and zap. You give a little sort of blip, a magnetic pulse, basically, applied to the brain, and crudely speaking, it kind of bounces around, and you see an electrical response that we can measure, and that seems to correlate very well with people who are known to be in conscious or unconscious states, for example, under anesthesia. And it's, they compare it to if there isn't conscious activity there, they say that it's a bit like it's going through a cracked bell, and the reflection you get isn't as good. So this is one method that is being developed, but it's still a bit of a black box. We don't quite know.
To understand, save that for the lightning talks. To understand my comment, Phil was an editor at Nature for many years. He knows, I think, just about everybody he's spoken about. He knows the literature better than just about anybody I know. So for me to unfairly paraphrase nobody knows anything based on somebody who knows as much as anybody knows about everything means there really is a hole. There really is something missing. Now, given the answer you just gave, do you believe there are electronic correlates of consciousness? Is there transferability between the neuro studies and the inanimate studies?
The neuro studies and the inanimate.
So if you take the ringing bell example.
Right,
I have a new research project in my lab to build physically reconfigurable computers that we're going to use to make inference systems. And if I turn that on and I can see that ringing behavior, does that mean it's conscious?
Well, exactly. I think that's really the point, that I don't think techniques like that are, it seems that they're based on a correlation. And that may be good enough for clinical use, but there's no understanding of causation there. And so if we're starting to ask, as I think we are going to have to do, is there some measure of consciousness or sentience or whatever you want to call it in this artificial intelligence, you're starting from scratch. I don't see any way in which you can use a technique like that in a way that's going to be helpful to you. And it's not even clear to me, given the different neural architectures that if we're talking about cephalopods, for for example, I very much doubt that any sort of technique like that is going to tell you anything meaningful about whether you can assign consciousness to a cephalopod.
And again, I find this really striking. If you look at all the talks today about everything everybody knows about so much, it's really striking. Right at the heart of this big sort of black hole, this big thing that's missing.
And I think it's partly a reflection of the fact that it was just an area that you weren't meant to go to in the 60s and 70s, and you found yourself, even now, there's a degree of nervousness about talking about it, and that often it's philosophers of mind who've dealt in this area and are now having to start to get to grips with what, if anything, the tools of neuroscience can tell them. But I think neuroscientists themselves are kind of playing something of a catching up game.
Thank you for taking this on.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And now to neatly wrap all of this up, Joi.
I'm going to just mess it all up. But I'll start by, first of all, admitting that I am not a monotheist like many of you. I come from Japanese background, and our family is Shinto. The good thing about Shinto is you don't really have to believe that much to be Shinto. It's mostly ritual. And in the Dewey Decimal System, it's in the 299 other category of religions, and often called the primitive religion. But I like Shinto because Shinto speaks to a lot of this in a kind of interesting way. So if you look at, first of all, I'm very glad that many of you have transcended many of the old sort of human exceptionalism themes of just animals aren't smart and all this other stuff. But I still think there's a little bit of that going on. And I think if you look at the history of human exceptionalism, it kind of starts out a lot with, well, it predates the monotheists, but the monotheists definitely had a hard time with animals because animals don't believe in God. And how can you be as good as a human being if you don't believe in God? And then I think also animal husbandry and agrarian systems had to create a method for us to rationalize the ownership of nature. Because if you look at indigenous communities like the Shintos, like a lot of the indigenous oceanic people, or even the Native Americans, they didn't understand the concept that the Europeans brought here when they wanted to buy land and own land. Because you don't own nature. Nature is part of you, and you are part of nature, and it's a big, complex, adaptive system in which we are integrated. And so the idea that humans are anything special, other than possibly computationally sophisticated, is actually somewhat a human exceptionalist thing. And I think talking about consciousness, so a tinge of Buddhism is also mixed into the Japanese religious pot. So in Buddhism, there are 9 levels of consciousness, right? The first 5 levels are your senses. The 6th level is what you're, I think, mostly talking about, which is computation, information. But level 7 is the subconscious. So that's actually, the subconscious actually can kind of do stuff in parallel, and this depends kind of what your definition of the subconscious, but it's the part where massive amounts of information are being processed in parallel. And actually, cephalopods and a lot of animals might do subconscious better than we do, right? And then if you look at planetary systems, or you look at our gut biome, these are complex parallel computations that are going on. And then if you go to level 8 of Buddhist consciousness, it's really the I am one with everything. And in that sense, geology might be much more conscious than we are. So I teach a course with the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi Rinpoche, and we work a lot on meditation, on awareness, and trying to become aware of our own consciousness and ourselves. And part of the first step is to stop thinking, to actually become still, to become aware of your own mind. And we had a very interesting conversation when we were talking about stillness, and one of the students asked, well, are rocks aware? And we sat around talking about whether rocks were aware, and could you feel and become like a rock? And so I think even with the animal sort of communication, I think definitely, we've all touched on this with machines and other things, but I mean, I think if you think about our whole system as a complex adaptive system, and if you think about, for example, and I know we're talking about sort of the network of communication. I mean, for instance, our gut biome we know, significantly influences our desires through the vagus nervous system and things like that. A lot of the things that we want to eat or we want to do are because of the balance of our gut biome. And so we are definitely more than just the human brain, that's for sure. But then you have parasites like Toxoplasma gondii. So they get into, its reproductive, sexual reproductive path requires a rat and a cat, right? And many of you may have seen the TED Talk on this, but it's very interesting. So when it infects the mouse brain, it induces a change in the way that mice behave to, instead of running away from the smell of feline urine, it runs towards it, so that it's more likely to be consumed by a cat then puts it more likely in the reproductive pathway that this thing requires. And so if you were to say, well, does the rat have free will? Who's in charge here? Who's doing the thinking? Who's conscious? It's very interesting because the relationship between this Toxoplasma gondii and the rat is very similar to the relationship between our gut biome and the molecules that our gut biome. We have more, many of the neurotransmitters that we use in our brain exist in our gut, and often in more volume. There's a pretty good argument, at least, that maybe these neurotransmitters were designed initially for the bacteria to talk to each other, and then our brains started using those same molecules to then start to communicate with each other, and that, in fact, this relationship between our gut and our brain has a lot. So the gut-immune-brain axis is a really interesting network. But then getting back to sort of this notion of sort of the way that, so I've been working a lot with indigenous communities and climate, and there's a group called Neatero, which is, I'm the head of the science advisory board for that, but it's a sort of, we've worked in conservation for a long time. Conservation used to be, you kick the indigenous people off the land and patrol it with rangers. And what we figured out once you did the math, and this is the MacArthur Foundation and Conservation International, we figured out that 80% of the world's biodiversity, or 85, happens to occur on the 25% of the land, or the surface of the earth, if you include the Marshall Islands and others, that is controlled by indigenous people. So why is it that most of the biodiversity is on the place where indigenous people live? Well, because indigenous people are great at protecting the environment, because they have lived for thousands of years in a symbiotic relationship with their environment in a sustainable way. And they don't think of sustainability as something that you're suffering from. Sustainability is a flourishing state. And the Shinto, so one of my favorite shrines, the Ise Shrine, is 3,000 years old. And for the last 1,300 years, so there was Emperor Tenmu, who was a pretty smart guy, because he said, okay, we're going to stop eating animals, because that's not very sustainable. And we're going to take this shrine, and we're going to start rebuilding it every 20 years so that the craftsmen can teach each other the craft. And every time we cut down the part of the forest to rebuild the shrine, we replant it. And so if you go to Ise Shrine, there's a section of forest for every, for hundreds of years, for every shrine that's going to be built. And it doesn't grow, and the shrine continues. And sometimes they change things. One of the feathers of a bird became endangered. So, okay, we'll change the bird. You know, so it's sort of a practical evolution, but it has evolved over thousands of years. But they're completely happy. You visit Ise Shrine, it's beautiful, but it's not growing. Japan is also has been pretty stagnant for the last couple of decades, and we have a shrinking, aging population, but we have more Michelin stars in Tokyo than any other city in the world. And so I think one of the kind of important things that I kind of want to stress as we start to think about consciousness and putting ourselves on the pedestal. So are animals as smart as us? If we rank them from 1 to 10, where's the bonobo? Where's the cephalopod? Well, we're pretty good at compute, but I would suggest that compute may be the thing that has screwed up the climate, because it got pretty good at extraction and consumption. We're getting kind of obese, and we're getting kind of having lots of chronic diseases that come from the complexity of the systems that we've created, because we can produce calories, package them, deliver them, market them, and we even have escalators to our gyms so that we don't exercise, right? And so all of this efficiency that comes from our ability to compute and just do things so well, because we're so clever and we're so conscious, may be the things that are causing social unrest, inequality, climate change, and all these other things. So if we were to say, are we wise? Obviously we're not wise, because the world is probably in more danger of an existential threat to many, many things than it's ever been. So what is wisdom? Well, if you look at a rainforest, the rainforest is really smart. If it's like not touched by human beings. It's pretty resilient. It's got a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of information. Because I think the communication piece that we were talking about is really important, but there's chemical communication. I mean, the way that a rainforest adapts with other things are there are nutrients and there are chemicals and there's all kinds of things that are looping back and forth. And that information, without any central planner, without any true consciousness, at least at level 6, but you have like the subconscious level where everything is connected to each other, and somehow we're able to get to some sort of balance and some sort of richness and flourishing and resilience in a rainforest without what we would call consciousness, although the Buddhists would call it consciousness. And our body is able to get to a homeostasis. Now, we have parts of our brain that probably help our body balance, but there's a lot of stuff going on that probably we wouldn't call conscious thinking. And so I would urge us, as we think about the communication system of interspecies communications, to think about the rocks, to think about things like rainforests, to think about, because the internet, the great thing about the internet is that we went from this sort of monolithic, centralized, top-down controlled system that was bulky, expensive, and clunky, and was just not, I hated it the old way, right? And then the great thing about the internet, although it's also causing, it's a little bit of a problematic child right now, but was that we could decentralize things, and somehow the network itself, to me, felt like the thing. It wasn't that somebody was in charge of this whole thing, although we kept trying to get out of in charge when we were in charge for a minute. But the beauty of the network is really this dynamic resilience and robustness that the network had. And so I think I would pop up a level and say, can the interspecies communication system that we have be the consciousness, rather than worrying about the consciousness of the nodes? And then can we expand it to include everything? And I do think, that the intelligence of these indigenous worldviews can benefit us a lot, because I do think, so I think that science and engineering is great. I'm here at MIT. It's hard to deny that I'm very attracted to it, but I really do think that this idea, that necessity to reduce things to things that are understandable and quantifiable is a really important thing, and this is how science moves forward. But we also need to resist the urge to try to reduce everything, because I think that we lose a lot of information in that translation. It's kind of turning things digital and trying to compress it. And so I guess the main point I would say is reduce reduction. Try to think about things in a, as much as possible, non-human exceptional way, and use this as an opportunity to not learn specifically from the other species, but to kind of expand ourselves and sort of transcend the human species.
Thank you. Exercise. Yeah. In this goalpost moving exercise, Vint didn't mention, but one of Vint's interests was to get ready to talk to extraterrestrial intelligence, that when the time comes, we need to practice in our backyard. Then when we were getting ready for this meeting, Joi really moved the goalpost. I thought this was a real stretch to do interspecies communication, and he pointed out we were forgetting the rocks. And he means it really literally, that the species, in a sense, includes rocks. It includes the life of the geology. It includes the planet. So, Joi, you're being chastised. Don't leave us hanging. What is level 9?
No, I said there's 8. Oh, wait.
Is this Fortran or C?
I have to look it up. I was just looking it up on the internet. So I think, let me check. I'll have to get back to you.
Okay, he'll get back to you.
Yeah.
Well, I have an answer to that. Oh, Vin has an answer.
So, you know how the OSI model says there are 7 layers in architecture? Layer 8 is the political layer, and layer 9 is the religious layer. So
that's a great lead in. Joi?
I think so. Level 9 is the one with everything. Level 8 is the subconscious. And level 6, I think, is the mind, and it's a level 7 that I can't remember.
Okay, Joi.
Yes.
Since you spoke last, you get to answer do other animals have spirituality?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I really do feel like everything has spiritual. So in Shinto, one of the beautiful things about Shinto, two things I'll say. One is thinking about things in a different way. So there's this great clinical computational psychiatrist that was showing an fMRI of people who believe in God and people who don't believe in God. And when you ask them a question, their brains map very differently because they think of like self first versus God. I think the way you think about things changes how you think and changes even the wiring of your brain. And the Shinto believe that everything has a spirit, including rocks. But what's really beautiful is that in Shintoism, even nothingness has a spirit, right? And so it takes quite a bit of...
So they're physicists.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it takes quite a bit of mind wrangling to get your head around and your heart around the notion that nothingness has a spirit. And to me, if being a monotheist changes human brains to, when you ask somebody are you proud of your work? Somebody, according to this researcher, if you are atheist, you think about yourself first. If you're a monotheist, you think about, there's like this part that the God part triggers, so you're thinking, what does God think about me? And then, but it's kind of interesting. So I believe that if you can change people's sort of frameworks around how they think about, say, nature, and you start to believe that rocks have a spirit, then it becomes much more difficult for you to be, you might start to think certain categories of waste as disgusting, viscerally, in a way that we only think about it rationally. So the answer is, I think, yes. I think everything, and you have to believe that everything has a spirit if we're going to get past this problem where we're causing harm to the environment that we're in.
But then what's changed? You could interpret that as back to the past, that the old ways were the good ways.
Well, I think what you
What's
can't...
the argument? What changes from just they had it right?
Yeah, well, and it's I don't think you can go backwards, but I think what we can do, but I still think there are paradigms, historical paradigms, and we do this all the time. You do this all the time. You yank out really old ideas from science that might not have worked back then. So I think we're in a world where it's suddenly so complex. We're starting to realize that the world is networked and complex, and many things are unknowable. And we have philosophies that were sort of pre-Enlightenment in how we dealt with the unknowable in more sophisticated ways. And we got to a point where we believed that everything should be rationally knowable, and we got into that really far. But then now we're realizing through quantum mechanics, through biology, through these other things, that actually, in fact, figuring it all out isn't really going to actually save us. So I think it's not back to the past, but it's drawing on the past.
Good. So with that, here's what's going to happen. First, we thank this panel for taking on all these hard questions.